It has been 40 years since the BBC first broadcast the chilling nuclear war film Threads. I'm Sean Judge, and along with nuclear war podcaster and author Julie McDowall, we recently spoke with the director Mick Jackson to pose our questions and to seek his insight into the lasting devastating legacy that Threads has carried now for 4 decades.
Okay, well, our first question, Mick, is from one of my podcast listeners, Doug Grant. And Doug asks, was Mick Jackson aware that people like us are all fascinated by Threads all these years later?
Yes, I was aware. Ever since I made that film 40 years ago, periodically, like once a year, once every 2 years, I check into the Internet Media Database and just check the comments. And, depending on the severity of the Cold War or the international tensions, whatever at the time, there's always a couple of hundred comments down there, and they keep changing through the years. But there's always a groundswell there of either people who said, I saw it as a kid when I wasn't supposed to, and I peered around the door, and I've been thinking about it ever since. It scared the hell out of me. Or people who say, see this movie. I only just saw it, and I just realized what a terrifying movie it is. You have to see this. So, yeah, I was aware of that. Very few people on Earth have ever seen a nuclear weapon explode for real. But it's so outside any human experience you have. If you're there and you watch it, you're changed by that. But most people don't know that. They don't know that when a nuclear weapon detonates, it's 20 million degrees. That's the temperature of the sun, which is 93 million miles away. Imagine that happening just a few miles away from you, feeling that blistering heat on your skin, being thrown backwards by the shock wave. The reason I made Threads, and the reason why people are so, I think, obsessed with it, is that you don't know that stuff. That's so outside any experience of life. I know whenever politicians start using phrases like Trump used when he was in power, threatening Kim Jong-un with fire and fury like the world has ever known. Well, he didn't know that. And every time you watch Threads, I think whether you're a politician or just someone in the street, you are brought face to face with what we're really talking about. And maybe that gives you pause.
Do you take it as a badge of honor, I suppose, Mick, that you've influenced people like this? Are you proud of it?
The day after it went out, I got a phone call from someone who'd been my boss at the BBC in the science department. And he said, you're lucky you're the only person who could have done this at this time. And that's kind of surprised me a little. He said, look, you're a scientist by training. You know how to read scientific papers and graphs and talk to scientists. You've been to conferences and so on. You're very knowledgeable. But you're also an experienced filmmaker. You've been directing for 15, 20 years. And you have a cinematic imagination. And most important of all, you're working for the BBC, which has the resources to make this and has the impetus to make this because of past shame about the war game. So I feel I was the designated person at this point in history to make this. Somebody else might have made it. I just happened to have been there. Like Peter Watkins was the designated person when he made the war game. Didn't work out so well for him. The BBC banned that. That was the shame that I felt at BBC back in the 80s. So I don't so much feel proud of it as glad that I was there and able to do it.
I think quite nice as well that it was also a catalyst for them also eventually showing the war game.
Yes, the war game was actually shown a day later, or a couple of days later in that period when Threads went out.
I've got a question from David McKinnon, who is one of the members of my group. Similar lines, really, but how do you feel personally knowing that your work scarred a generation?
I would say it wasn't my work. It was the facts that scarred a generation. Some people say the more you kind of overwhelm them with scenes of destruction and despair, the more you just kind of push them into a kind of helplessness, kind of numbness about it. But that's not true. You have to trust people with the truth. You have to trust them to make... I mean, it's the central fact of our lifetimes that nuclear war is always just kind of a slip off the knife edge away from us. And if you don't know that, and you don't hold politicians responsible for knowing that too, then you're not living in the world that actually surrounds you. You watch images from Mariupol or Gaza City or way back from Dresden, and after a bit, all ruined cities tend to look the same. the implication in seeing those ruins, with people pulling bodies out of the rubble, is that sometime after that, the war will be over, whatever will be over, and the cavalry will come in and rebuild things up again. Think about Threads. The central truth of it is there may not be any cavalry afterwards. There may not be someone to come along and rescue everything and build it up again. It just goes on. And that's why Threads really tries to address that by covering a 13-year span. So it doesn't end. There is no afterwards. The afterwards just never comes. It's a continuation of the present.
I do think actually your point about it, we live on a kind of razor's edge with these weapons, that, it is just sort of happenstance and fate that we haven't had a nuclear war, I suppose. I think that fact is what keeps it relevant still, because it isn't just the Cold War. It is the fact that you can watch this today in 2024, and I mean, it's been 30 years since I was at school, and even then, really all you heard about atomic weapons was Hiroshima. You'd get a day on Hiroshima if you were lucky.
Right.
And that's proper history. That's back then in the past. The realization that Threads is a potential that still lives with us, that you maybe just don't think about. We go on without thinking about it actively until somebody shows you Threads.
Well, I mean, it's scarily like today. The scenario in Threads begins with the Russians invading a neighboring country. It happened to be Afghanistan then, or in Threads it was Iran, just like Ukraine now.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at this movie now, people ask, why don't you remake it, update it? Because looks like old history. The first 40 or so minutes of the movie. It's set in the 1980s. There's no CNN, there's no cell phones, no internet. The cars and everything are very dated. But you do get to know these people. And 47 minutes into the movie, when that first warhead explodes, it really doesn't matter what you were wearing or what cell phone you had. It's the same. Nuclear weapons haven't changed. The physics of nuclear weapons haven't changed. They will still do this to you. If you update it, maybe, I don't know. I'm philosophically against remakes, I think. They never really tell you something the original didn't, and you lose something of the passion and the kind of electricity, the lightning in a bottle of the original thing. So I think
So I'm just going to pick up one of the questions that we've got coming up, because actually one of the questions was from Richard Collum. I'm just going to jump ahead, Julie, for this one, because it does say, if you were making Threads today, what changes, if any, would you bring in? I
wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think a lot of us, particularly the diehard fans, for want of a better way of putting it, is it does feel like sacrilege to think about remaking it. And I think many of us would just say it doesn't need to happen. But in my mind, I feel like there may at some point need to be something that carries the torch, that carries the message for generations that just don't recognize the world that Threads is set in anymore. And I don't think we're quite there yet, but another 20 years maybe. And I think something has to carry not just the warning, I suppose, to not just younger generations, but younger politicians, as we get further away from it hanging over us so overtly.
I think you can think of a number of scenarios that would lead to what happens in Threads, contemporary scenarios. I don't think that changes the point. What I wanted to make in Threads was something that was so strange and so different from anything you'd seen that it would stick in your head. I'm talking about nuclear weapons being something that kind of is so unfamiliar that it's impossible to get your head around something that's unthinkable. You just can't literally think about it because you have no images in your head to think. I thought in Threads, I will make this curious hybrid that's not like a documentary and it's not like a drama. It's a mix of the two, and it will have such images of such startling power that a lifetime later, you'll still remember them. You remember the melting milk bottles. You remember the woman with the dead baby. And you can't get those. And every time somebody mentions, we're going to escalate to de-escalate because the other side will back down, those images should come into your head. Whatever the scenario led to, That's still. I have this gizmo here. This is something I got with the textbook, Glasstone and Dolan, The Effects of Nuclear Weapons. Tucked into the back of the textbook is this. It's a nuclear bomb effects calculator. And with this, kind of like a slide rule, you can enter where you are, how far away from the burst, how many megatons it is, and it will tell you how hot the fireball is, how deep the crater is, how fast you'll be traveling when you hit a wall, whether your eardrums will rupture or not, and so on. That hasn't changed. That happens when a nuclear weapon explodes, however updated you make the film.
Yeah.
So that's the reality that you have to, as you know, I had problems with tensions with Barry Hines in the movie because it was difficult for him, having done so many wonderful movies with Ken Loach, to accept that a drama couldn't encapsulate something this big. And it had to be something that was sui generis, which is Latin for one of a kind, that actually you only need to watch once because it would stay with you. And he said, but all these kind of narrator things that you put in with the voiceover telling you about things and the graphics, that doesn't belong in a drama. I said, well, no. That's what makes it special. And it's still special. I'd say that not because of pride of ownership or anything like that, but we tried to make it something that would be a thing of its own. So that's why I don't want, if anybody wants to remake it, they're welcome to. But I think the thing itself and the fact that it isn't part of a genre of disaster movies like the Towering Inferno or the Poseidon Adventure, there's a danger of that. If everybody keeps remaking it, it does lose some of its power. And I'd like this to remain just a thing, a kind of talisman in the culture.
Thank you, Mick. Our next question is from Louise Connors, and she asks about the extras in the film. And she says, for example, when you were filming the bombing scene on the Moor shopping precinct, did they all have to run around screaming for hours? And was there direction on where to run, how to react, or was it a free-for-all?
Yeah, some of all of those, really. If I imagine at some point in their lives, a lot of people in the audience will have been to a movie set or watched it being filmed in the street outside them or something. And one thing that always puzzles them is, why do they do the same thing over and over and over again? They've got it, haven't they? Well, no, they haven't. And with something like Threads, where I wanted to get a sense of documentary immediacy, you don't want to choreograph it too much. People know why they're there, and they will do what they do. And if they don't do it right, then you maybe make a couple of suggestions. But the reason you do it over and over again is each time you're getting a little bit of a mosaic. You're getting 2 or 3 seconds. Like when the woman picks up her baby out of the wheelchair, out of the pushchair. That's pure gold. And you make a tile pattern of these, a mosaic of these, to convey the impression of what it's like. There are extras there that you put there deliberately, like the woman with the child in the baby stroller and the old woman with the basket and so on. All that stuff. That's going to give you some shots which are useful. But you don't know what everybody else is going to do. In that scene, they don't know what they're going to do. And you can over-choreograph something to the point where it doesn't reel at all. But people not knowing what to do is what that scene is all about, as the sirens go off. So that's the reason why it was done over and over again with multiple cameras. And each time you get a bit of a picture, you put it together and it really hits you. This is what it would be like. People don't know what to do. Do they run into British home stores? Do they just freeze in the spot? Do they pee themselves? All of that happens in that scene.
I love that we see British home stores because it makes me think of my sister was working in good old Marks and Spencer on the day of 9/11, and she remembers a lot of women coming up to the counter to ask her what had happened, as if they thought there'll be safety or there'll be answers in Marks and Spencer, as if that was a place that they should flee to or go to for some kind of security. So I always think of that when I see the British home stores. That would be a place that seems safe. Horror can't happen to you in British home stores.
Terrible thought.
It's always funny as well that we've got the British home stores, and I think it's Woolworths, isn't it, that flash up.
They explode, yeah.
Both of them don't exist now. So
well, that's the result of Threads, I'm afraid. Sorry, I apologize.
There you go.
Our next question, Mick, is from me, and it might seem quite trivial, but I've always wondered, why did you choose Johnny B Goode as the little piece of recurring music in the film?
The film has a very thoughtful sound design. In the first part of the movie, the first 47 minutes before anything happens, you're aware of the music of society. There are radio broadcasts, TV broadcasts, music playing everywhere. The music of the second half of the movie is wind and silence. So I wanted something that was the opposite of that to set the movie going with a bang. I grew up with rock and roll for me has a vitality to it. It's life. So I wanted life itself to be ba 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 ba, good old Chuck Berry. And that's why, after you miss it after that, except you hear it a little bit in the background of the pub scene. But then you hear it again right at the very end of the movie, at the most searingly bleak part of the movie. Someone's got a cassette tape. One of the soldiers has a cassette tape they found somewhere and they're playing it. And then the irony of everything that's been lost is in Johnny B Goode. Tinny sound in the background as she walks to have her baby across the ruins. That's why I said.
Thank you.
It's nice to know there's some thought actually there, because I think a few of us have posited whether it's just something the BBC picked because they had access to certain tunes, and I think it's nice to know there's that you had that control actually.
Yeah. Quite a lot actually. Talking about terms of control, did the BBC say, anticipating one of your questions, I think, did the BBC try to interfere and say that's going too far, or you can't show that? They had a lot of shame to make up. I joined the BBC in the mid-1960s, around about the time that the war game was banned. I had seen it, but I knew that when I entered the BBC, it was kind of like entering a no-go area. You didn't talk about it. There's a sense of something in big corporations that you feel that you mustn't talk about. People do talk about kind of under their breath. And that was the shame everybody who worked for the BBC felt, that it had banned the war game. Now, it was a very complicated situation it was a game of chicken, really, between the Home Office and the BBC, and the BBC ultimately were the ones who backed down. Government said, we'd be very relieved if you didn't show this, but wouldn't actually take the blame themselves. So I think the BBC felt that shame. I felt that shame. That's why, come the 1980s, when I was trying to have kids with my new marriage, I thought, what kind of world is it I'm bringing kids into? And therefore, that was kind of a spurring thing, as an aside, to making threads. But yeah, the BBC had a lot to do to make up for that shame. So I think the climate of trying to push threads out was much better than it had been for Watkins. And I didn't get a single note from them. Imagine that. I mean, as a filmmaker in Hollywood, I get notes all the time at the bane of my existence. But they said, just get it right. Go spend a year if you have to researching this thing. Get it right, so we know it's watertight and it's non-political and it's non-partisan and it's impassioned, but dispassionate. Do what you have to do. I got one note. The head of BBC Two, when I ran a rough cut of the movie, started out by saying, well, I think that the tension lacks a little in that scene, one of the early scenes, like when Ruth is announcing her pregnancy. That was all I heard from him. By the end of the movie, he hadn't said a word, hadn't made any notes at all. And Brian Wenham, BBC, said at a press screening, this is a major piece of work. You were right to insist on this, and we were right to make it. So that was a kind of vindication, really.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing. Next question is actually one of mine, which is, I've read many of your interviews and things in the past, and we've heard about how immediately following the broadcast that you didn't get the usual congratulatory phone calls that you may have been expecting. Do you remember what sort of feedback you started to get once things trickled through in the coming days?
Yeah, well, there was to be expected from a conservative part of the population, some pushback. The head editorial in the next day's Daily Telegraph was, scare us again, Sam. And that was kind of, accusing us really of fear-mongering and to no real effect. But I did get a letter from Neil Kinnock, you know about this, the dangers of complacency are much greater than any risks of knowledge. And I know recently I've got that on my wall, and he's got that on his wall, that letter he wrote to me and Barry Hines the day after. Again, making the same point that you've got to trust people with the truth. I got a certain amount of that, and a little while later, because Fletcher's only went out in the UK, Ted Turner, who founded CNN, saw the movie and thought, I must run this in the US. And he ran it on his WTBS superstation in Atlanta. And I happened to be in the US researching another movie the day after it went out there. And I was in the Senate, the US Senate, and talking to Senate aides about doing some research on something to do with the CIA. And they said, oh, you know, George Shultz, Secretary of State, watched that last night. I thought, oh, wow. But did he say anything to Reagan? And they didn't know that. They thought he'd certainly mentioned it. Maybe Reagan even saw it. I don't know that. But I do know that up to that point, he'd been in a kind of war of words with Gorbachev. And, you know, as everybody knows, calling them an evil empire. Certainly it's the Star Wars thing that made Russia think that the US was preparing a first strike against them. They wouldn't be able to respond to. But the thought that Reagan had actually seen it stayed with me. There was a front page cartoon on the front page of the Times, a Mel Kalman cartoon of two people reading a newspaper, and the headline said Reagan's peace speech. And one of the characters is saying to the other, do you think he saw threads?
Excellent.
I hope he did.
Okay, the next question is from me. After a day's filming, did the cast and crew go out for drinks to de-stress? And speaking of stress, I interviewed Rita May for my podcast, Mrs. Kemp, obviously, and she said she remembered hiding herself behind a pillar and crying when she saw the film's first screening in Sheffield. So do you have any memories of that, of cast or crew getting upset by the subject matter? And did you all
No.
just head out for a drink after?
Well, we had a drink afterwards because they were heavy days.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you a sense of the pressure of shooting it. We shot in 17 days. I mean, the BBC may have been behind it, but they didn't give me very many resources. I had 250,000 quid and 17 days to shoot it, and that was it. So pressure was on everybody. Everybody knew that we were doing something that was important, and that whatever happened, we'd improvise, we'd make do, we'd push past the restrictions. Had a great bonding experience on everybody. But no, we weren't depressed by it. We were kind of pleased that we were in the middle of that. What you're talking about is a screening that we arranged for the extras who were from all over the place in Sheffield for the crowd scenes, like fleeing the city or the panic on the moor. They'd been aware of what it was they were doing. They knew the context, knew this was a terrifying film about nuclear war, but it didn't hit them until that screening. They saw it up on the screen, and the result was incredibly emotional, like Rita described. You know, people were weeping because they saw not what they'd done. You know, oh, weren't we great in that movie? They saw a vision of their own city, Sheffield, being reduced to this horrible wasteland, and you know, it really hit them.
Okay, thank you.
I have to say, I think me and Julie and myself made a bit of a pilgrimage to Sheffield. Was that last year or the year before?
2 years when the Queen died.
Yeah, that was it. Because then when everyone was watching the royal funeral, I was out filming the high street with a drone because it was empty and I thought it looked good. It felt very, having watched the film myself so many times, and I'm sure for you, Julie, suddenly being there and being in the pub, I can't imagine having watched it with the grounding of knowing those surroundings on such a personal level. You know, it just must have been so much more visceral to see, you know, your school involved and things like that. I can't even imagine watching it when it was broadcast, to be honest. I don't know how people managed to make it through. Anyway, the next question is one of mine, which is there was a Newsnight debate with various politicians involved that was broadcast around the same time. Did you watch it? Do you remember?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I watched it go out. We talked about this before, but there's a kind of camaraderie in the BBC with you and your colleagues about what you do. And, you like, offer them criticism afterwards. So usually when you have a movie that goes out, documentary or drama, whatever it is, the credits roll at the end and the phone rings and rings and rings and rings. It's your friends, your colleagues coming in on line after line saying, either that was fantastic, I loved it, well done, you deserve a medal for that, or the kind of coded phrase, well, you made some kind of interesting and bold choices there, which is kind of code for it sucked. But none of that happened. I looked at the phone and it didn't ring, and it didn't ring, and it didn't ring. And I just sat there. I switched the set off and thought, well, what is this? I mean, did I really kind of blow the whole thing? And I'm going to be fired tomorrow because this was the most devastating, bad movie of all time in that sense. And it wasn't until the next morning I started talking to people, and they said, I just sat there like I had after the movie, virtually unable to get out of my chair. I just sat there thinking. I didn't want to go to bed because I didn't want to have the dreams that I thought would come with having seen that. And somebody described it to me the next day as the night when Britain didn't sleep.
Yeah.
People just sat there thinking about it and thinking about what if.
Yeah.
Well, I'd been thinking about what if because my wife was pregnant by that time, first child. And that's one of the reasons I made the movie. The morning after, I was supposed to get on a train and go to Pebble Mill at 1 to do an interview. And so I had a beeper. We had beepers in those days before cell phones on my belt. And if she went into labor, that beeper would tell me. But I got into the studio and sat down for the interview. They took the beeper away. So we can't have that going off in the interview. So I didn't know. Fortunately, she was, in the last weeks of labor. So she didn't go into labor. But I now am approaching my daughter's 40th birthday. I made the film partly for her to kind of try and do what I could to shape the future world she was coming into. She has decided she doesn't want children because it's a world like threats, climate change, nuclear war, political division. So that's kind of ironic for me personally. Sad.
I think you certainly played your part in driving that responsibility. Yeah, I think I'm glad you did it. To be honest, I think when you were didn't get any phone calls after the broadcast, I'm surprised you didn't pick up the phone, checking it was still connected as a
well,
as
I
opposed to
did.
it being some ill-timed transition to war. Yeah.
No. It's interesting that in 2017 there was a poll commissioned by jointly British Film Institute and the Paris Review, I think. They came up with a list of the 10 films that shook the world. Things like Battleship Potemkin and so on. Threads was on the top of that list. So, something happened with this movie. I mean, it's the power of the movie is still in there in the movie, whether you remake it or not, whether you update it or not. It's still in there. I almost didn't make it. I was in pre-production and I heard that ABC were making a movie about nuclear war for the American market with, let us say, a slightly bigger budget than I had. I had 250,000 quid. They had 7 million. And I thought, oh God, okay, if they make it, then I'll stop. And at that point, I was just the driving engine within the BBC for making it. If I said, I don't want to make it, they would have said, oh, okay. And I thought, you can't do this more than once. You can't, as I said, you can't make it into a genre of dark disaster movie. If they get it right, that's fine. If it's salutary, if it knocks people out of their seats, fine. But they don't need threats to come along and do that again. So I kind of held things in abeyance for a while. And then when I saw it, for example, the hospital scene with Jason Robards. It's soap opera. The lights are still on. People are making impassioned speeches about what they saw and feelings. And you compare that with the hospital scene in Threads with kind of blood and sweat and urine and on the floor. That's what it would be like. And I thought, well, okay, they did it. Good luck to them. I know that Nick Meyer tried to do the same thing I did to start with. He was the director of the ABC movie. He said, I don't want any stars in this. I don't want any schmaltzy music. None of that stuff. I just want the facts. But the censors at ABC said, you can't do that. The network censors, the standards and practices people said, you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't do that. You can't say that, show that, whatever. So he instead put all that money into CGI special effects and put Jason Robards and John Lithgow and various other people in starring roles, and it was a soap opera. The thing is, if you're going to do something like this, you have to do what I did. Make it something so different from any other genre that it stands out. People take notice of it. You can't do it within the confines of a soap opera, movie of the week thing. You've got to make it something like Threads, which is unclassified, a thing. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, like you say, about it being on the top of films that shook the world, and like I found it on an IMDb list 20 years ago of just top 10 disturbing films, and the fact that it's always topping these lists above horror films, above shock films. I mean, firstly, like you say, it's the content of the film. I mean, it's the fact that it is a real threat. But it just doesn't fit into that. It's so often listed alongside horror films but it just isn't a horror film because it's not ghosts.
It's an existential horror. It's
Yeah.
not a blood and gore kind of horror thing. It's not Freddy from Elm Street.
It would be Lovecraftian if it wasn't real technology. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just wanted all those images, to stick in people's heads.
And
You've got to give people, if you want people to understand something that's beyond their experience, you've got to give them a visual vocabulary to think about it.
Absolutely. I think as well, for those people that watch it once and never want to watch it again, it's absolutely done its job. And then there are people, again, Julie, I don't know about yourself, but those people that have sort of let themselves sit with the concept for a while, you do put yourself into visceral things where you do think about what the heat would feel like, or the thing that always gets me is how loud it would be, because you can't comprehend that level of pressure, and fundamentally you wouldn't hear it would damage your hearing, but that just the extremes of sensory perception in every possible dimension.
Somebody I spoke to when I was making Threats, to your point here, it was a scientist who worked on nuclear weapons, a nuclear physicist. I think it was Frank Barnaby, who's now dead, who worked at Aldermaston on British nuclear weapons, said, when I hear people saying, like Trump has been saying, or like Reagan was saying, or like Putin is saying, we can win, we can escalate, the other side will back down. I just want to take them out to the Nevada desert, strip them down to their underwear so they can feel the blistering on their own chests and then be knocked over backwards by the blast wave. They maybe don't hear it because their hearing is blown out anyway. Then again, after that, you wouldn't hear them say things like fire and fury like no one's ever seen before, or bloody nose strike, or any of these other conveniently political and hawkish sounding phrases that actually are nothing to do with the enormity of 20 million degrees happening in your street.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Mick. The next question here, we've mentioned with the War Game, of course, and The Day After, but Greg Hill asks, what's your opinion on the film version of When the Wind Blows?
One of the things that spurred me to make Threads was the difference between people who kind of, like, there's a Tom Lehrer song, "We will all go together when we go." Like, it will all be over like that, and we needn't worry. We won't be there to worry about it. And back in the 1980s, there were still people who remembered the Blitz, remembered World War II. And because there was nothing else to get their heads around, that's what came into their heads when people talk about nuclear war, as if it would be like that, only a bit worse. But we still come out with a cup of tea afterwards in the ruins, and we'd all make it go away. I thought it was a very, very skilled way of using that, and a very human way of using that feeling of you don't know quite what's happening, but somehow or other we'll get by, and then showing that it all disintegrates into this awfully bleak and sad ending. I thought it was brilliant. It's another way of approaching the same subject, and reaches audiences in a different way. Mine was maybe more explicit, and that was very touching.
Considering what we know about how the government very subtly interfered with the production, or should we say the broadcast of the war game, we know that you and Barry Hines attended Easingwold Home Defence College, and were there any restrictions put on you at any point during that in exchange for that sort of access? Now, I know, I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, I've recently sent you the letter about players' notes. So, there was a little bit of back and forth behind the scenes.
There was some trepidation on the part of the Home Office about whether we should be allowed there because of what we might do, particularly since I said, I would like to share some of this with the actors who are playing the controllers in the bunker afterwards. And they thought that might be used for CND propaganda against them. So, no, the understanding was that they would let Barry and me sit in on this Operation Hot Seat, it was called. And the tit for tat was not, we will have any control over that, but it would be a courtesy if you would show us the movie before it goes out, and then we can prepare our own response to it and maybe make some suggestions, but you don't have to take them. It wasn't censorship in that way. I mean, they'd been bitten by the war game too, didn't want to repeat that. Easingwold was just ludicrous. I mean, the people were there with good intentions. Everybody had good intentions, but the basic fact, digression here in answering your story. At the end of the 90s, when once classified papers were revealed again, it was revealed that shortly after World War II, Churchill was again Prime Minister, had secretly told the BBC, which was then the only broadcast of radio and TV in the country, you will not mention nuclear war, not in discussions, not in plays, not in documentaries, nothing. You don't even want to mention that. The reason for that was that he knew, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as most Western leaders knew, as their scientific advisors were telling them, you cannot defend an urban population, a civilian population. You can't protect them from nuclear war. And so it's best not to go there. So he didn't go there until the 80s and the Panorama release of the Protect and Survive films and all that. I mean, the war game was an attempt to break out of that silence, and brilliant piece of filmmaking. Unfortunately, it was the wrong time in terms of the BBC. So I've forgotten what your original. That was a digression. I've forgotten what your original question was.
Just about. You touched on it. Just about the restrictions, if any, were put on you. In exchange.
So we went to Easingwold and we saw people, in a bucolic setting, an old country house, view over the fields and trees and so on, having a nice breakfast, comfortable night in the accommodation there, going and acting nuclear war, which was very stressful. But, in the evening, they rang up their wife and kids at home and they said, how's it going today? Oh, a bit boring today, but quite stressful at times. None of what would be happening in a real situation was there at all in the environment. They weren't stressed. They weren't, using L-SANs in a very stuffy, confined space where you didn't get anything except the smell of the other people there. None of that stress and anxiety of the real world was there. So we tried to put what wasn't there into threats in those scenes in the bunker under Sheffield Town Hall. So we showed it to the Home Office. I was ushered into one of the top level BBC offices, I think it was Brian Wenham's, I can't remember, with representatives of the Home Office who came with sheafs of notes. This is before it went out. And two very strange young guys who sat just behind my peripheral vision, but I was aware they were there the whole time just watching me, which is, I don't know if it was there to take notes of their own or they were there to intimidate me. It did feel a little bit intimidating. But they started out with these lists of things that they thought were errors in. They said, I mean, like in the scene in the mall with people rushing about with shopping bags, that wouldn't happen because we told everybody in advance that you must go and stock up for 2 weeks' supply. And I said, but no, in your exercises, you say, supplies are running short. Nobody's got anything to buy in the supermarkets. No wonder they're out for looking for food. Yeah. So the advantage of having been on that exercise was that I was able to take their own scenarios, their own exercises, and just turn it back to them. So they retreated in the end, and the 2 young men left with them. I was intact and not beaten up. I was wondering if they were there to grab me by the shoulders or something.
You never know.
No, not seriously, but it was interesting being able to use the fact that I had done so much research and had talked to people like Duncan Campbell about the home office exercises and had seen it with Barry Hines. We had used kind of our own intuition of the way the world is to take that stuff and make it seem real in threads.
Was there any, I mean, 2 things follow from that really. Was there anything there that just completely blew your mind that you weren't expecting? Or was there anything there that changed the direction of certain things you were planning to do?
No, I think it actually helped us be confident in what we were doing. That was very interesting, and that's the way that the characters in our movie would have been trained, not as experts, but just as counselors who went on a course and who would know, a lot more than that, and be subject to these enormous stresses and impossible problems. Those exercises, by the way, were so carefully designed that the food wouldn't run out. If you played it right in an exercise, there would be enough food for everybody. And, it was a time to take place, fictitiously in the spring, so that by the time you got to the end of the exercise, the harvest was coming in and everybody was saved. So that was obviously very satisfying if you did the exercise and not at all like real life. So that was useful.
Great for a parlor game, not so much for keeping humanity alive.
I mean, their intentions were good, but you just cannot, I don't know, you can't protect a civilian population. Everybody knew that except the public. You are following Churchill's ban, there was no information out there. People didn't until Panorama came up with those films, realized that they existed, or that they would be on sale in a pamphlet that you bought beforehand.
The next, sorry, Mick, go ahead.
No, please.
My next question is from me, and it's quite blunt, I suppose. Do you still worry about the threat of nuclear war? Do you feel it's drawing closer, given the recent, developments with Russia and Ukraine?
Of course I do. Yes, it is. It's a very scary time to be alive. It's even scarier than it was in Threads. In Threads, we showed communications and command and control breaking down very early. That would be even earlier now. The decision time for politicians with hypersonic missiles arriving virtually straight away, or nuclear torpedoes or cruise missiles coming from submarines just off the coast of the US or the UK. There's very little time for decision making, and it's very unforgiving of error. And also with AI being used to automatically take decisions about targeting and launching, it's incredibly knife edge, seems to me. And I'm very distressed that, Putin keeps using the threat of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, as, the game of chicken. I could detonate something, he would think, over the Black Sea, just to make you back off, not want to go. But what if you don't back off? And what if there are unexpected casualties? What if a small tactical nuke was used near Poland and created mass casualties because of the fallout? And somebody felt they had to respond to that. That's going on right now. And, as we speak, Biden is trying to decide whether he will authorize Ukraine to use long-range missiles deep into Russia. And how is Putin going to respond to that?
Yeah.
It's very worrying.
The BBC announced recently that they're going to show Threads again in October, and I think it's not before time, because I think a lot of people are complacent and need to be grabbed by the scruff of the neck and shown this is what is at stake, this is what could happen. So I'm certainly looking forward to October to see how maybe a new generation reacts to it.
Well, me too. And it's to your credit and Jude Rogers and people like you that you've been pressing the BBC for so long to retransmit this. I think not before time. I will be very interested in the reaction, and there will be reactions, people I know across the spectrum, who say, no, this is just scaring us, or who say, well, that was in the past. That's an old movie. It's different now. Well, it isn't.
No.
Thanks to this.
Always really surprised online when you see, and you get it with the day after, or anything nuclear war based, but people that watch Threads or the day after or Testament when the wind blows, any of these things, and they have the opinion that it's propaganda. And I'm like, who, like, for what? For humanity? Like, who do you think is coming off better out of this scenario? I'm not sure I understand that, but I feel that now, having seen that so many times, that is a defense people are throwing up to not have to accept the realities they're being shown. It must be propaganda because it's too devastating to think about it being anything else.
I think, I'm sorry.
No, carry on, please.
No, I think I had the advantage of making Threads, of coming out of a scientific department, science features in the BBC.
Yeah.
I started I have a first degree in electronics, and I decided before I went out into the world that wasn't for me, and I wanted to be a movie director. And so I went and got an MA in drama at a different university. And that's the way I entered a kind of mixed artistic and scientific soul into the BBC. And I think that's what helped me make Threads. I had a sense of drama, a sense of visual imagination, and science. And those things are non-partisan. I mean, as you say, the skill of telling a story is part of one's humanity, because you make that story resonate with the ordinary people. And the skill of being able to take information which gives a context for that is a scientific skill. So how to put it? The idea of Threads was that you would take unremarkable people, and that Barry Hines' contribution was to make them believable characters, like you, like me, not movie stars, and then subject them to the kind of sadomasochistic assault of everything a nuclear weapon does and everything a nuclear war entails, and see how they deal with it or how they don't deal with it. But nothing in the movie gives you a God's eye view. Nothing is kind of generals and politicians and people deep in control centers making strategic decisions. Everything that happens in the movie is within a couple of 100 yards of your main characters. They don't have a God's eye view. They don't know what's happening. The voiceover of Paul Vaughan, who would be familiar to that voice, would be familiar to people from Horizon, programs like that, is not the word, not the voice of God. It's the voice of physics. It's the laws of physics, inexorable, things like this. That's affecting the lives of those characters. That's what I think gives the movie its unimpeachable, I hope it is unimpeachable, credentials, that the science is real and the people feel like real human beings and what happens to them feels real. That's why, I think it has power even today to convey that. Barry and I had a lot of rows on the set. One in particular, I remember, was about, how do you reconcile this documentary bit with this drama bit, because Ken Loach never did anything like this. And I don't feel comfortable with doing this. So it was a shouting match between them. And the hotel manager eventually came out into the lobby and said, "Gentlemen, I know you were just rehearsing a scene, but could you rehearse it a little more quietly, because it's upsetting our other customers." But no, Barry, hated what was done, and really, when he saw a first cut of it, said, "Why don't you take all that stuff out?" And I said, "No, this makes it special." I gather from talking to his partner at the time, Eleanor, that he had gone to complain to Ken Loach. Said, "Yeah, I don't know why they did this thing." And Ken had said, "No, relax, Barry. It's okay. It works." That's what Eleanor said anyway. And before he died, he apparently came around to seeing that it did work. and was proud of it. We both shared the same intentions, the same humanist approach to it. I mean, and we both wanted the same thing, to make something that was salutary, that would move people. And he's a wonderful person to have worked with. He's a very gentle, passionate, angry man, but angry about the right things, about social injustice. And everything. So in the end, our collaboration produced Threads, and I'm glad it was. I'm sorry it was done at the expense of some tension, but it's worth it. Those are things worth arguing about, and that tension, I think, plays in the movie.
Yeah, completely agree. And funny enough, my last question was going to be about your working relationship with Barry Hines, because we've heard in the past about the sort of tensions on set. Curious if you've got any kind of smaller memories of working with him. And thing that's always kind of tickled my mind is whether you had conversations, presumably fatalistic given your thoughts and input into the film, but whether you had the sort of conversations that we often do about, what would you do if you heard the sirens?
Well, I'll respond to that in two ways. First, the main thing we agreed on in the movie was the structure, which is to use the imagery, the iconography of life as the backbone of the movie. It starts with an act of conception, which leads to a birth, which leads to a baby who grows up, and there's an act of conception, rape, which leads to a birth at the end. So life and death and birth is threaded through the movie that's about death. So that was something that we came up with early on. That was a really big creative child of our collaboration, I think. Together, what's the main point of your question? I'm sorry.
It was just about any smaller anecdotes about working together, but also whether you had those kind of down the pub conversations about what you'd do if you heard the sirens sounding.
No, I think being exposed to the scientific background, the research we got, we realized there is no such thing as a final gesture.
It doesn't.
What would you do when the sirens go? It's a ridiculous question to ask, because at that point you have no agency. You have no control over whether you live or die, what happens to you. Your instinct is to run, to seek shelter. But if you think, I'm going to make a noble gesture, I'm going to go out while having sex or while drinking a pint of beer or whatever, when the 4-minute warning goes. Not that there would be a 4-minute warning anymore with this kind of immediacy of having to make a decision. But no, the idea that you do a final gesture, a dramatic gesture, that's gone out of the window with everything else. It's quite fatalistic. What happens to you, and you have very little control. So no, we didn't have those conversations.
I think the crux of the beautiful cultural thing that Threads did is it stopped those conversations being so throwaway bravado or comic, because it was an easy way of answering the what if for people down the pub or people at work. And yeah, I think Threads was probably a driving force in making people go, oh, there's a real answer to that, and I don't like it.
Anything you'd like to add, Mick, or anything that we wanted to cover that we haven't touched upon?
We touched upon most things, I think. I think the main thing that not worries me, that still in my head is how this helps. One of the starting points was that back in the 80s, there were people like Herman Kahn, a futurologist who worked at Hudson Institute, the Rand Corporation, who devised these scenarios for a ladder of escalation, as he called it. 44 steps in the ladder. It starts with a crisis at the bottom, and the further up you go, the worse it gets, until step 44 is a nuclear war that no one knows how to stop. It's just chaotic, and there's no control over it at all. And he was the one who came up with the idea that you would escalate to de-escalate. They do this, we do that, and that makes them back down. But what happens if they don't back down? That seemed to me a really powerfully negative thing that came out of all this futurology and strategizing. And it's still there. And it worries me that people, Biden is fretting over this at the moment. Do I go up against Putin because of what he will do, and will that push him over the edge? And if it does, what do we do? You've got to be aware of that whole background of what nuclear war is, that thing that's no longer thanks to threads, I hope, a distant thing in the imagination that you can't get your brain around, but a real possibility. That's what worries me.
I think the fact that like you say, the fundamental things that haven't changed, the weapons, the outcome and effects of the weapons, and the fact that the people still making the decisions to use these are people that just don't have that language, that mental language to be able to comprehend the outcome. And I think I've said this a few times that the thing that worries me going forward as we get further away from the people that lived through the Cold War and had it hanging over us is these, 20, 30-year-olds that are going into politics, that going into fundamentally being the people that control these weapons in the future. The further they get away from understanding what that truly entails, the higher the risk there is, I think, of using them.
Take them out to the desert, strip them to their underwear.
Probably the only argument for the occasional nuclear testing, to be honest, is to just say to, new generations, by the way, that'll melt the paint off of your cars from 5-10 miles away.
Yeah.
That's something I often think, the grey men of the Soviet Union that we feared in the 80s especially, at least they obviously lived through the horror of the Second World War. At least they knew that it's not something to be cavalier about, even though we feared them. They had that knowledge. And, younger politicians, as Sean says, how can they possibly comprehend what they're dealing with? And so therefore it might be easier for them to stumble into it, whereas at least the Soviet lot had constant memories of 1941 and how it must never be repeated. And we've lost that. I think we're all a bit too, or the younger generation maybe, a bit too cosseted, a bit too comfortable. And hopefully Threads, when it goes out again in October, will shake a lot of people out of that complacency.
Oh, God, I hope so. I hope so.
Politicians
and the people who hold them to account.
Yes.
I weirdly think the fact that the whole Putin Ukraine situation is sort of this weird paradox in that, given that he was, KGB or whatever, and lived through the Cold War and understands the risks and threat as much as anybody else, means that he knows the power in threatening it. But there's just enough left of his generation on the opposing sides to understand what that threat means. Because if that balance wasn't there, the threat wouldn't be understood, and therefore he'd either be playing a game he can't win himself at any point, or he wouldn't have chosen to do it in the first place. There's definitely going to become a point where that fear, that the only real power these weapons have is that theoretical power of fear, in maybe using them. And once that fear starts to dissipate, then that risk becomes higher, I think.
Also, just the fact that what you've just outlined is something that's an intellectual concept that you hold in your head. If you're actually in the moment and your radars pick up missiles coming in, you don't have time to think it through like that. You have to make a decision like that. Yeah. And what if that's not real, that radar? There have been, some really close scares over the years. A couple of times it's been Russian people down the military chain who've said, I don't think this is a real alert, let's not launch. But if you're Putin or you're Biden or Trump or whoever, and they say, well, we've got 30 seconds before we can't start to lose our assets because they're going to target the Minutemen in their silos. We've got to decide, do we launch? All that goes out of the window. You don't really have time even to trust your gut. That's scary. I mean, you're sitting there with the nuclear codes in front of you. You type the thing in, don't you?
Thank goodness we've got
watching.
Yeah.
Scary.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about one other thing that popped into my head the other day. Knowing that you left the UK at the towards the end of the 80s, did the thought of nuclear war cross your mind in the thought process of moving to the US? Ultimately, the outcome was the same.
Earlier, I moved to the US in the early 90s, end of the 80s, early 90s. Did my first feature, Chattahoochee and LA Story and Bodyguard around that time. And there was a point at which there was an attempted coup of Gorbachev, and he was taken away, and he simply forcefully argued with by people who wanted the return of the Soviet state. And at that point, I remember being in my living room thinking, oh my God, it's all going back, all this end of history stuff that we thought was going to last forever, the détente between the West and Russia. Now the Soviet Union has fallen. It's going back again. And I'm going to be drawn back into all that old imagery again, destruction. And it's really stayed like that since, I'm afraid. But there hasn't been really a relenting.
Yeah. On that happy note.
I'm sorry, I tend to rabbit on a long time. You can edit it down.
I just want to thank you again, Mick, for speaking to us. It's a real honour to speak to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Real honour.
Back to you. Thank you for keeping this flame alive, keeping it meaningful in people's lives.
Thank you.
Flame alive, probably isn't it? A very good metaphor. Given burning houses and burning cities and so on. But no, you have to feel about it with some degree of commitment to keep it going. I mean, I've said this before, and you probably read it and stuff. I have a painting of me up in the garage. John Bratby, the kitchen sink sort of painter, a Royal Academy painter, called me up after Threads and said, come down to my studio, I want to paint you. I paint famous people. Then I charged him and then give him the painting. He didn't say that bit. But I sat somewhere on the South Coast, and he painted me, and I had some sandwiches that his wife brought while we were chuckling away. And then he said, do you want to see? And it turned the painting around. And it's something that has haunted me ever since. That's why I keep it in the garage with its face to the wall. It's a picture of me. It's kind of a very, very rough thing, because that was his style. And the eyes have a sort of haunted quality to them, like someone who has been through PTSD of some kind. If that seems like an overblown way of describing it, what I mean is that in order to make Threads, I had to force myself to look at the world around me and say, how would this look if it were destroyed? If there were ruins over there, ruins there, and dead people here, and people on fire, and trees, and things like that. You have to force yourself day after day in the shooting to imagine that, even though you don't want to. You have to have this alternative reality in your head, as I had when I got painted by John Bratby. And it is like PTSD, because you find yourself going backwards and forwards between the real world and the imaginary world that's in your head that's destroyed. And it does get to you. I mean, not in the same way as if you've been in combat in Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that, but a similar thing. So that still stayed with me, and it's still up there like a Dorian Gray portrait in the garage. Lovely to talk to you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Very stimulating.
Yeah, thank you. Big honour. Thank you very much.
Hope it's useful.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye.